Hello and welcome back to Noble Green Wines. Last week we looked at the ways in which the vineyard affects the flavours of wine, and this week we're going to bring the grapes that you've just harvested into the winery. If they're very lucky grapes, they'll have been hand-picked in the vineyard, but most are realistically picked by machine, which can be a bit rough, so the grapes need to be sorted when they're first brought in. This is usually done by hand on a conveyor belt. Some places are really quite technical and use a laser. But it's basically just to get rid of any underripe or rotten grapes before they go to the pressing, because you don't want those flavours in your finished wine. The next stage that they usually go through is crushing and destemming in a machine, which is rather unimaginatively called a crusher destemmer. And this removes the grape pulp from the stems, and it then goes into the fermentation vat. The next stage is the division between whether you're doing a white wine, a rosé, or a red, and that's the maceration. Now, the maceration starts at roughly the same time as the fermentation. In the case of a rosé wine like this, it might be left on for as little as 6 hours up to 3 days, depending whether you want a really pale Provence rosé or quite a deep-coloured rosé, such as the ones you might find from Rioja or Argentina in some instances. Or if you want a red wine, the fermentation and the maceration can go up to 30 days or even beyond if you want quite a deep red wine. Now, during the fermentation, you generally want a long, slow, relatively cool fermentation, slightly cooler for white wines than for reds. The reason for this is so you don't extract too many sort of harsh phenolics, as they're called, from the grape skins, which can add a slightly astringent flavour to the wine. But you do want to extract all the colour and the tannins and the pigments from the grape skins. The other thing that you want to do with a cool fermentation is not to have it too cool, because then the wine can take on slightly artificial banana-like flavours. If you think of bubblegum, it's that sort of flavours that you extract. And you just need to judge it to get the right amount of extraction for the style of the wine that you're making. As well as rosé, if you're using white grapes, white skin grapes, you can leave them in contact with the skins for an extended period to create what is known as an orange wine, which we're starting to see on the market these days, the more traditional styles that originated in Georgia and areas like that. The first wine we've got today is an example of red grapes that have been left in contact, in this instance I'd say for about 6 to 12 hours, just to extract a small amount of colour from the skins. If you look at it, it's a lovely pale Provence rosé, very light in colour. There's grapes here are Grenache, Syrah and Cinsault, so the same sort of blend you would get in something like a Cotes de Rhone. So exactly the same grapes, if they were macerated for 20 to 30 days, you would essentially have a very, very different wine. This has got on the nose a lovely rosehip, red currant character, lovely fresh fruits, very fragrant, very light. The same fruits coming through on the palate, really nice character. This is a lovely picnic wine, the sort of thing that would be lovely on a summer's day with some cold cuts of meat, charcuterie, pâté, that kind of thing. So after the main maceration and fermentation, another thing that is usually done with wines in the winery is malolactic fermentation. Now, I don't want to get too technical, but it's important to understand how this impacts the flavour of your wine. This changes, it's an alcoholic fermentation that changes the malic acid, which is the acid you find in apples, which is quite tart and green, into lactic acid, which is the same acid you find in milk, which is a lot softer, so you often get that lovely buttery richness. Not necessarily without any influence of oak, it just softens the wine a little bit and makes it more approachable. Not everyone does this. Some champagne producers prefer not to do it. Chablis producers often prefer not to do it because it retains the acidity if that's what they want to keep in their wine. The other element that affects it is, with this wine, it's a blend, and that's something another winemaking decision, whether you have a single varietal, such as 100% Merlot like Chateau Petrus, or you have a blend, as in this case. Chardonnay you usually see on its own, but sometimes it's blended with Colombard. They work really well together. The art of blending is often, although Cabernet Sauvignon can be great on its own, it can be a little bit angular. Merlot on its own can be a bit fleshy, and together they are better than the sum of their parts in many instances. The blending is a decision as to what the end result is you want from the wine. Another important winemaking decision, and probably the most divisive, is with the use of oak. Now, oak influence can be imparted into the wine by fermenting in oak barrels, but most of the oak flavour you get in wines is from further maturation in oak barrels once the wine has been made. This example here, it's the same producer that we tried last time, the Ardeche Chardonnay, but the Grand Ardeche, the difference is it's had some time in oak. This, I believe, has had 10 months in French oak barrels. As with the last one, you can see the colour's slightly deeper again. Some of that is from the oak influence. Oak does impart a small amount of colour into a wine and some tannins, but mostly, as you can smell as soon as you raise the glass to your nose, it's that lovely toasty vanilla flavour that you get. The oak's not too overdone here, it's just in lovely balance with the character of the Chardonnay, that slightly warmer climate. And again, on the palate, you've got that lovely Chardonnay richness, much riper Chardonnay than from the Chablis we tried in the first session. But that lovely spicy finish is coming through from the oak. And when we say vanilla, it's not just that it tastes like vanilla. Vanillin is the same compound in oak that is found in vanilla pods that you would use in your baking at home. Also, this is French oak. And this is not to say that one is better than the other, but French oak is quite tightly grained. This is, I believe, a French oak barrel here. The actual grains in the wood are quite tightly spaced. And in American oak, they're slightly wider, so you get more of that vanilla flavour coming through from American oak than you would from a French oak barrel. Again, that's a winemaking decision as to which they want to use. In France, naturally, they tend towards French oak barrels. And in America, if you think of those really rich, buttery Chardonnays from California, they're almost exclusively made with American oak. A few will use French oak just because they want to make something that's a bit more old world in style. Again, that's their winemaker's decision as to what they want to do. Another thing that influences the character of the oak is how much it's charred. In order to bend the staves of the oak barrel around, they fire the inside, and with usually a gas burner, and they bend the staves in. And in doing that, the inside of the barrel gets a small amount of charring, which helps to release some of those vanilla flavours. And the degree of charring is now almost a science in itself as to how much charring you want. The winemaker can select barrels that have been charred to specific degrees, depending on how much of the vanilla flavour, the oak flavour, they want to extract when the wine's in the barrel. One other thing that an oak barrel is useful for is quite often producers will use old oak, like this one here, and that's because they want the gradual ingress of oxygen into the wine while it's maturing in the barrel. What this does is it allows a certain controlled amount of oxidation that helps the wine's flavour develop and gain in complexity without getting too much of the sort of oak flavouring into the wine if they don't want too much of an oak flavour in the wine. This is more commonly used in areas like Bordeaux. In Rioja, for example, they tend to use new oak because they want lots of that lovely vanilla flavour. Quite often they'll use American oak for the reason I've just outlined, that it gives that really toasty, oaky flavour. But you may find second fill barrels being used, so they're used for a second year, so you've still got quite a bit of the oak flavouring in, but it's not quite as harsh or as pronounced as it is from using it in the first year. And some winery producers actually now started using something called micro-oxygenation, and that's basically doing the same thing as a barrel, but it's a lot cheaper because you've just got a little piece of ceramic in there, just bubbling in tiny amounts of air to help aerate the wine and help it mature in a tank rather than an expensive oak barrel. And one other winery technique that is more commonly used than people think is associated with Beaujolais, and we'll move on to try one of those next, this Fleurie, is carbonic maceration, or semi-carbonic maceration more accurately. And this is where the grapes are left in whole bunches on their stems in a tank. They're harvested very carefully to prevent them from the grapes from getting damaged too much. They're blanketed under carbon dioxide, and what happens is the normal alcoholic fermentation can't start, so there's an intracellular fermentation that happens within the grapes without the presence of oxygen. And what this does is it helps extract a lot of the flavours and the pigments from the grape without getting too many of those harsher chemicals like tannins and so on, which is what it helps emphasise a lot of the fruitiness in wine, which is Beaujolais synonymous with. But you're actually starting to find quite a few Rhone producers are using it, and it's used to a certain degree around the world to sort of emphasise the fruitiness of a wine before the normal alcoholic fermentation takes over. This example here is a really nice Fleurie, a fantastic producer, Domaine Chignard. Already looking at the colour, lovely pale colour, nice sort of mid-red colour, lovely red currant fruit coming through, a little bit of oak influence on there as well. On the palate, tiny little bit of tannins. It's had a normal alcoholic fermentation as well. The Gamay, which is the grape this is made from, doesn't have many tannins to start with, so it's a lovely medium-bodied wine. Tannins slightly powdery, if you can feel them in your mouth, just coating your mouth a little bit, but they're not gripping onto anything. They're not puckering your mouth up like a strong cup of tea would, for example. Lovely fruit character coming through again, that lovely sort of velvety plum flavour coming through. Quite a long finish. This is quite a serious wine. People often think that Beaujolais is meant to be drunk young. It actually can age really well. This Beaujolais could actually develop much further and develop those sort of secondary and tertiary aromas. And that's probably the final decision, which is the one that's in your hands, is do you drink the wine when you bought it, when it's young and fruity, or it's been aged to the degree to which the winemaker wants it to be aged to? Do you age it further? So this Fleurie has elements of both youth and development in it. It's had the development from its time in barrel. And that's one of the other winemaking decisions, is do you release your wine when it's young and fruity, like Beaujolais Nouveau, which is fine, you know, it's nice and fresh, or do you age it with priors to release either in oak barrels or in tank or in bottle? Some producers do all three, like Rioja. It's only released when they think it's ready to drink. And that's a decision that, depending on whether you want primary aromas, secondary aromas, or tertiary aromas. And these broadly, primary aromas and flavours are what you get from a very young, fruity wine. Secondary aromas are things that have been added to the wine, like oak aging and oxidative aging. Tertiary aromas, I would describe it as more the flavours of a mature wine, which can be things like leaf mould, those lovely sort of earthy bonfire autumnal flavours that you get from a very mature claret, for example. And that's the final decision, which is in your hands once it's left the winemaker, is do you drink your wine when you buy it? Do you cellar it? And at what point do you enjoy it? And that's something we'll come on to later. Thank you.